Hi everybody, and welcome to our module on the B vitamins. There are 8 B vitamins. I've listed their names on the screen here. The reason they are called B vitamins is because many years ago people thought there were only 2 vitamins. They named the one fat-soluble vitamin, vitamin A, and they named the water-soluble vitamin, vitamin B. Of course, now we know there are many more water-soluble vitamins, so they are named B1 through B12 depending on what they do. But still, all the B vitamins are water-soluble, and this makes them different from the non-B vitamins. Most of those are fat-soluble, with the one exception being vitamin C. And because the B vitamins are water soluble, they tend to wash out quickly if they're deficient in the diet. Most of them are not stored in large amounts inside the body, so you can become deficient in one of these vitamins in a few weeks to months if you don't consume them regularly. The one exception to that rule is vitamin B12. It's stored in the liver mainly and also in the muscles, so it takes a lot longer to get deficient in vitamin B12. The hard part about studying the B vitamins is that they're used in many different metabolic pathways, and they have effects on lots of different types of tissues when you are deficient in a B vitamin. Their greatest effect when you become deficient is on rapidly growing tissues. So as we will see in this module, when patients are deficient in the B vitamins, they commonly develop symptoms like dermatitis, which is a rash on the skin, glossitis, which is swelling or redness of the tongue, diarrhea, which is abnormalities of the GI tract, and cheilitis, which is skin breakdown at the corners of the lips. For each vitamin, I'll talk about which of these symptoms is more common. Some of them are classic for one vitamin deficiency versus another, but in general, when you see symptoms like this described in a board question, you should know that they are probably talking about one of the B vitamins. The first B vitamin is vitamin B1. It's also called thiamine, and it is converted to an active form called thiamine pyrophosphate inside of cells in the body. On the bottom left-hand side of the screen is the chemical structure of thiamine, and you can see that it has lots of nitrogens and a sulfur molecule and also an oxygen molecule, and structures that have nitrogens and sulfur and oxygen tend to be water soluble. As we'll see in another module, the fat-soluble vitamins are composed almost entirely of carbon and hydrogen. That is not the case for thiamine. That makes it easy to remember that it's going to be a water-soluble vitamin. Thiamine is converted to thiamine pyrophosphate by adding 2 phosphate groups that come from ATP, and in the process ATP is converted to AMP. And thiamine pyrophosphate is a cofactor for 4 important enzymes. The first one is pyruvate dehydrogenase. We'll talk about this in a minute. Also alpha-ketoglutarate dehydrogenase, which is part of the TCA cycle, and also alpha-keto acid dehydrogenase, which is important for metabolism of branched-chain amino acids. And then the final enzyme is not a dehydrogenase. It's called transketolase, and it's part of the HMP shunt. Pyruvate dehydrogenase is the prototype of one of the dehydrogenase complex enzymes. It converts pyruvate into acetyl-CoA. Pyruvate dehydrogenase complex is a complex of 3 enzymes. I talk about this in a separate module. The enzymes are contained in subunits called E1, E2, and E3, and it is the E1 subunit that contains the enzyme pyruvate dehydrogenase. And all 3 of these dehydrogenase complexes require 5 cofactors. The first cofactor is thiamine, which, as we just discussed, is vitamin B1. But these dehydrogenase complexes also require vitamin B2, which is important for synthesis of NAD, and vitamin B3, which you need to synthesize FAD, and then finally vitamin B5, which you need to synthesize coenzyme A. And then the last cofactor is not a vitamin, it's called lipoic acid. Alpha-ketoglutarate dehydrogenase is part of the TCA cycle. It converts alpha-ketoglutarate into succinyl-CoA, but it is a dehydrogenase complex just like pyruvate dehydrogenase complex. It contains those 3 subunits, and it requires the same 5 cofactors. There are 3 so-called branched-chain amino acids. They are valine, leucine, and isoleucine. All of them contain a carbon branch as part of their chemical structure. And metabolism of these 3 amino acids depends on an enzyme called alpha-ketoglutarate dehydrogenase, which is also a multi-subunit complex just like pyruvate dehydrogenase, and it requires the same 5 cofactors, including thiamine. And if you are deficient in this enzyme, you will develop a condition called maple syrup urine disease, which I talk about in the amino acid modules. The fourth enzyme that requires thiamine as a cofactor is different from the other 3 because it is not a dehydrogenase complex. This enzyme is called transketolase, and it's part of the HMP shunt, which I talk about in a separate module. The role of transketolase is to convert molecules back into fructose 6-phosphate so they can re-enter glycolysis after going through the HMP shunt. The important thing to know about transketolase is that it may play a role in development of Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome. Wernicke-Korsakoff is a syndrome that alcoholics develop when they are deficient in thiamine. It's a cognitive syndrome, and there are data that abnormal transketolase enzymes may predispose alcoholics to development of Wernicke-Korsakoff. In fact, the data say that affected individuals may have abnormal binding of thiamine to their version of transketolase inside of their cells. The two clinical syndromes that develop from thiamine deficiency are beriberi and Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome. Beriberi occurs in underdeveloped areas where people are malnourished, like this child shown on the screen here. The symptoms are divided into the dry and wet symptoms. The dry symptoms are basically neurological and muscular. They consist of polyneuritis, which will be pain over nerve roots, and muscle weakness. The wet symptoms come from tachycardia. These patients can develop a tachycardia and develop high output heart failure, and they can develop edema. Basically, when you see edema, you call it wet beriberi. If you don't see edema, you call it dry beriberi. Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome is a syndrome that develops among alcoholics. They are malnourished and they have poor absorption of vitamins, including thiamine. They can develop confusion and confabulation and ataxia and ophthalmoplegia, which can lead to blurry vision. And I talk about Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome in more detail in the neurology modules. When patients present to emergency rooms in a malnourished state like alcoholics, they are often hypoglycemic as well as deficient in thiamine. And there is concern that if you give glucose without replacing the thiamine, these patients won't be able to metabolize the glucose. Remember that you need thiamine for pyruvate dehydrogenase, so if you give glucose without thiamine, these patients may not be able to metabolize the glucose, and this may be shunted to lactic acid and make them sick. And in fact, there are some case reports of worsening Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome among patients who are given glucose without being also given thiamine. Now you should know that in actual practice, this has been called into question. There have been hypoglycemic patients who suffered a delay in receiving therapy as someone was searching for thiamine to give them at the same time, and they went on to develop seizures. So many emergency rooms will administer glucose right away to someone who is hypoglycemic and then go and administer the thiamine. But you should be aware about this theoretical concern and the case reports of worsening symptoms among patients who are given glucose without being given thiamine at the same time. Vitamin B2 is riboflavin. This is the structure of riboflavin on the screen. You can see that it has lots of oxygens and nitrogens as well, and therefore this is going to be a water-soluble vitamin. The most important role of riboflavin is to synthesize molecules of flavin adenine dinucleotide, which you may know as FAD. If you add the structure of riboflavin to a molecule of adenosine, you will get the structure of FAD. And then if you add 2 electrons, you can get FADH2. And FAD and FADH2 are both required by the dehydrogenase complex enzymes we discussed previously, and as you may know, they are also used in the electron transport chain. In addition to its role in synthesis of FAD and FADH2, riboflavin is also used to synthesize flavin mononucleotide, or FMN. FMN is part of complex 1 in the electron transport chain. In complex 1, electrons are transported from NADH ultimately to coenzyme Q, but in the middle there are several intermediates, including flavin mononucleotide. A pure riboflavin deficiency is very rare. Patients with this condition have been reported to develop dermatitis, which is a skin rash, and glossitis, which is swelling and redness of the tongue, and these two things can develop in many other B vitamin deficiencies. In addition, chylitis, which is inflammation of the lips and cracks in the skin at the corners of the mouth, is a classic symptom of a riboflavin deficiency. And then finally, in lab animals who have been specifically deprived of riboflavin, they've been shown to develop corneal vascularization, which is new blood vessel growth in the cornea, and this can potentially lead to vision problems. Vitamin B3 is niacin. This is the structure of niacin on the top right of the screen. You can see that it contains a nitrogen atom and 2 oxygen atoms, and therefore it's going to be water soluble. Niacin is very important for synthesis of NADH and NADPH. NADH is nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, and it contains a modified version of the niacin vitamin. NADH, you may know, is important for electron transport, and NAD+ is required by the dehydrogenase complex enzymes. Niacin is not a vitamin in the true sense of the word, and that's because your body can synthesize it from the amino acid tryptophan. This is the structure of tryptophan on the screen, and it can be converted into niacin via a process that requires vitamin B6. This is important because, as we'll discuss later, when you are deficient in vitamin B6, some of the symptoms that develop are symptoms of niacin deficiency, and that's because you can't synthesize niacin from tryptophan. Niacin is found in grains and milks and meats, and people that eat liver consume lots of niacin, but importantly, it is not found in corn. And there are parts of the world where people eat an entirely corn-based diet, and those people are vulnerable for niacin deficiency. The clinical syndrome that develops in niacin deficiency is called pellagra, and it consists of the 4Ds: dermatitis, diarrhea, dementia, and death. This is a picture of a man with pellagra on the screen, and you can see that he has a rash on the sun-exposed areas of his body, so predominantly in his arms and on his face. And that's the classic rash of pellagra. It occurs in the sun-exposed areas. Initially, it can appear like a bad sunburn, but then it can develop blisters and scaling. It classically occurs on the dorsal surfaces of the hands, as shown in the picture here, and then it also involves the face, neck, arms, and feet, all the sun-exposed areas of the body. There are three rare clinical scenarios in which niacin deficiency can develop that are high yield to know for step one. The first one is INH therapy. INH is isoniazid, and it is a drug used to treat tuberculosis infections. As we'll discuss in a few slides, INH leads to decreased vitamin B6 activity, and like I told you before, you need vitamin B6 to synthesize niacin from tryptophan. So if you are taking INH, you will have low B6 activity, and this can lead to a niacin deficiency from inability to synthesize niacin from tryptophan. And this is a picture of some mycobacteria on the screen here to remind you that INH therapy can lead to a niacin deficiency. The other two clinical syndromes in which niacin deficiency can develop are Hartnup disease and carcinoid syndrome. Hartnup disease is an autosomal recessive inherited condition where children are born with absence of an amino acid transporter in the proximal tubule. As a result, they cannot reabsorb tryptophan, and they lose tryptophan in the urine, and this can lead to symptoms of niacin deficiency because you don't have the tryptophan available from which to synthesize niacin. Carcinoid syndrome is caused by GI tumors that secrete serotonin. These patients develop diarrhea, flushing, and cardiac valve disease. The reason these patients can develop a niacin deficiency is because the carcinoid syndrome results in abnormal tryptophan metabolism. Tryptophan is used to synthesize serotonin, but normally only about 1% of your tryptophan gets used to make serotonin. However, in patients with the carcinoid syndrome, up to 70% of the serotonin in the body can be used to make serotonin. As a result, tryptophan deficiency can develop, and in fact, symptoms of pellagra have been reported among patients who have the carcinoid syndrome. Niacin is also used as a treatment for hyperlipidemia. It has direct effects on lipolysis. This is unrelated to its role in NAD and NADP synthesis, and I talk about the use of niacin in hyperlipidemia in the lipid modules. The symptoms of taking excess niacin are facial flushing, and this occurs in patients who need to take excess niacin to treat hyperlipidemia. Niacin can stimulate the release of prostaglandins in the skin. As a result, the face turns red and warm. You can blunt this effect with aspirin, which inhibits the prostaglandin release. You can tell patients to take an aspirin prior to taking their niacin if they need it for hyperlipidemia. In addition, this effect fades with time, so patients who take niacin chronically will see less redness of the face after they've been on the vitamin supplement for a while. Vitamin B5 is pantothenic acid. This is the structure of pantothenic acid on the screen. You can see it has oxygens and nitrogens, so it's going to be a water-soluble vitamin. One of its most important roles is in synthesis of coenzyme A. Anytime you see a reaction or a structure that requires coenzyme A, you should know that that reaction or structure requires vitamin B5 as well. This is the pantothenic acid portion of coenzyme A. The vitamin basically gets embedded into the molecule. You may know that coenzyme A is very important for the synthesis of acetyl-CoA. This is the structure of acetyl-CoA. It is coenzyme A with a group added to the end of the molecule. CoA is also required by the dehydrogenase enzymes, and it's also required by several other enzymes. Here's an example of one of the enzymes that requires vitamin B5. This is the first step in the beta oxidation of fatty acids. Fatty acids are converted to fatty acyl-CoA by the enzyme long-chain fatty acyl-CoA synthetase. This enzyme requires CoA, which it adds to the fatty acid to make fatty acyl-CoA. And anytime you see that CoA is required, you should remember that that means vitamin B5 is also required because you need that to synthesize coenzyme A. Vitamin B5 is widely distributed in foods, and deficiency is very rare. There are reports of deficiency of this vitamin leading to nonspecific GI symptoms like nausea, vomiting, and cramps. There are also reports of numbness and paresthesias developing. A classic paresthesia for a vitamin B5 deficiency is one that feels like burning feet. In addition, you'll see in some review books that adrenal gland problems can occur in B5 deficiency. That's because necrosis of the adrenal glands has been reported in animal studies when animals were specifically deprived of vitamin B5. There are three compounds that are collectively referred to as vitamin B6. The first one is pyridoxine, which you can find in plants. The other two are pyridoxal and pyridoxamine, which you can find in animals and meat products. This is the structure of pyridoxamine, pyridoxal, and pyridoxine on the screen here. And the reason that they can all work as vitamin B6 is because all three can be converted into pyridoxal phosphate, whose structure is shown on the screen here. This is the active form of vitamin B6, and it can be derived from any of these three structures on the screen. Vitamin B6 is very frustrating to study as a medical student because it's a cofactor in many different types of reactions. I'm going to go through some of these on the next few slides. The first type of reaction where vitamin B6 is important is in the so-called aminotransferase reactions that are important for the metabolism of amino acids. This is an example of one aminotransferase reaction on the screen here. In this reaction, the amino group from aspartate is transferred to alpha-ketoglutarate. As a result, you synthesize a molecule of glutamate and you leave behind a molecule of oxaloacetate. Basically, you have transferred the amino group from aspartate to alpha-ketoglutarate. That's why it's called an aminotransferase reaction. And these are all catalyzed by the aminotransferase enzymes. In this case, the enzyme is aspartate aminotransferase, or AST. B6 is also very important in the synthesis of neurotransmitters. It plays a role in the pathways for synthesizing dopamine, norepinephrine, epinephrine, serotonin, and GABA. In the amino acid modules, I talk about homocysteine, and in the pathway of converting methionine into homocysteine and then cysteine, you need an enzyme called cystathionine synthase, and that requires vitamin B6 to convert homocysteine into cystathionine. Histamine, which you may know is very important in mast cells and other cells in the body, is derived from the amino acid histidine. It is synthesized by an enzyme called histidine decarboxylase, and this enzyme requires vitamin B6. Here's a slide from our glycogen module. This slide depicts the enzymes that break down branched and unbranched glycogen into glucose. One of the enzymes that participates in this process is glycogen phosphorylase, and glycogen phosphorylase requires vitamin B6. As I told you before, niacin can be synthesized from the amino acid tryptophan, and the conversion of tryptophan into niacin requires vitamin B6. Therefore, some of the symptoms of a vitamin B6 deficiency can include the symptoms of a niacin deficiency. Vitamin B6 is also required for the synthesis of gamma-aminolevulinic acid, or ALA, and ALA is a very important intermediate in the synthesis of heme. To make heme molecules for hemoglobin, you start with succinyl-CoA and the amino acid glycine. Those are used to build ALA molecules, and ALA is then converted into heme. If you are deficient in vitamin B6, this means you can develop a sideroblastic anemia. A sideroblastic anemia occurs when iron cannot be incorporated into heme properly and iron accumulates in the red blood cell cytoplasm. This is a picture of a sideroblast on the screen here, and that is what is seen in sideroblastic anemias. You may also know that lead poisoning can cause a sideroblastic anemia, and that's because lead poisoning interferes with the conversion of ALA into heme. Vitamin B6, on the other hand, is necessary for the synthesis of ALA from succinyl-CoA and glycine. I mentioned this before, but I'll go into more detail now. Isoniazid is also called INH, and it is a drug used to treat tuberculosis. And isoniazid has a similar chemical structure to vitamin B6. This is the structure of isoniazid on the bottom right of the screen, and this is pyridoxal on the bottom left. They both have a nitrogen-containing ring. The reason this is important is because isoniazid can form an inactive version of pyridoxal phosphate. As a result, because this is inactive, you will have a relative B6 deficiency. Enzymes will try to use this inactive form and it won't function correctly, and they won't be able to carry out the reactions that require vitamin B6. As a result, patients who take INH are always supplemented with vitamin B6 so that they don't develop symptoms of a B6 deficiency. Years ago, there were concerns that women taking oral contraceptives could become deficient in vitamins, and there was especially concern that they could become deficient in folate, and then if they had an oral contraceptive failure, they would become pregnant with a folate deficiency induced by the oral contraceptives. It turns out that the modern versions of oral contraceptives do not generally cause a folate deficiency. However, they do seem to increase the vitamin B6 requirements. The mechanism of this is unclear, and deficiency symptoms are very rare, but you are sometimes asked about this on your boards, and you should know that oral contraceptives can interfere with B6 metabolism. A pure vitamin B6 deficiency is very rare. CNS symptoms are classic, including seizures and confusion and neuropathy. Also, other symptoms that go along with B vitamin deficiencies, including glossitis and oral ulcers. Most of the fat-soluble vitamins have a toxicity syndrome that occurs if you take too much of the vitamin. Because they are fat-soluble, they can accumulate in the body. This is generally not true for the B vitamins. They're water-soluble, so if you take too much, they usually just wash out in the urine. Vitamin B6 is the exception. It's the only B vitamin with potential toxicity. There's toxicity that can occur with massive intake. This usually happens when people take lots of supplements. It's usually not from consuming too much B6 in the diet. The syndrome that develops is a sensory neuropathy. The mechanism is not clear. It's usually pain and numbness in the legs and sometimes difficulty walking. The last B vitamin we'll discuss in this module is vitamin B7, which is biotin. This is the structure of biotin on the screen. You can see there are lots of oxygens and nitrogens, so this is going to be a water-soluble vitamin. And biotin's role is as a cofactor in carboxylation enzymes. All of these enzymes add a one-carbon group from carbon dioxide to a molecular structure. And the three enzymes you should know for step one are pyruvate carboxylase, acetyl-CoA carboxylase, and propionyl-CoA carboxylase. Pyruvate carboxylase plays an important role in gluconeogenesis. As I said before, it adds one carbon to the structure of pyruvate to create oxaloacetate. All of these carboxylase enzymes require carbon dioxide. They also require ATP and they require biotin. So therefore, they're sometimes called the ABC enzymes because they require ATP, biotin, and CO2. Acetyl-CoA carboxylase is another one of the ABC enzymes. It uses ATP, biotin, and CO2. It's part of the fatty acid synthesis pathway. It converts acetyl-CoA into malonyl-CoA by adding a CO2 group to the end of acetyl-CoA, and that gives you a molecule of malonyl-CoA. The third ABC enzyme is propionyl-CoA carboxylase. It converts propionyl-CoA into methylmalonyl-CoA, which can then be converted into succinyl-CoA to enter the TCA cycle. And this is a pathway by which many different structures enter the TCA cycle. Odd-chain fatty acids can be converted to propionyl-CoA. So can the amino acids valine, methionine, isoleucine, and threonine. And some people use the mnemonic VOMIT to remember these structures. The V is for valine, the O is for odd-chain fatty acids, and then M, I, and T are for these three amino acids right here. Biotin deficiency is very rare because it's a widely distributed vitamin. The one way people sometimes get biotin deficient is through massive consumption of raw egg whites. Egg whites contain a substance called avidin that binds biotin and prevents its absorption. As a result, if you're eating lots and lots of raw egg whites in your diet, you can develop biotin deficiency, and the symptoms are relatively nonspecific. There's a dermatitis, swelling of the tongue, loss of appetite, and nausea. For the last slide in this module, I will quickly mention the absorption of the B vitamins. They are all absorbed from the diet in the small intestine, most of them in the jejunum. The one exception is vitamin B12, which I'll discuss in another module. B12 is absorbed in the terminal ileum. And that concludes our module on B vitamins.